Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I've brought you a news story that's absolutely explosive in the international scene and could completely change the geopolitical balance as we know it. We're talking about the bombshell statements from Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov about the recent United States actions in Venezuela and the threats against Iran. And look, when Russia speaks this way, we need to pay attention because the implications are massive. So let's understand what happened. This past Wednesday, January 14th, Lavrov gave a press conference in Moscow after talks with Namibia's Minister of International Relations, and it was in this press conference that he unleashed criticism against the United States in a way we rarely see in international diplomacy. He accused the Americans of literally shattering the international system that they themselves helped build. Let me repeat that because it's important. Russia is saying that the U.S. is destroying the very world order they created. Now, what specifically triggered this reaction from Lavrov? Two main things. First, there's what he calls an illegal U.S. operation to topple Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. According to Lavrov, this isn't just a political disagreement or some diplomatic tension. He's calling it a gross violation of international law. Those are strong words in the diplomatic world. When a foreign minister of a major power like Russia uses terms like gross violation of international law, Hanend, that's essentially diplomatic language for saying this is completely unacceptable and illegitimate. Second, we have the U.S. threats against Iran. Lavrov made it crystal clear that Russia isn't backing down from its partnerships. He stated that Russia remains committed to its agreements with both Venezuela and Iran, and that no other country can change the nature of ties between Russia and these nations. This is Russia drawing a line in the sand, folks. They're saying, these are our allies, we have agreements with them, and we're not abandoning them just because Washington doesn't like it. But here's where it gets really interesting. Lavrov didn't just criticize these specific actions. He went much bigger picture. He said that the entire international order, along with globalization, has been flushed down the drain and is now fragmenting. Think about what that means for a second. We're talking about the system that's been in place since the end of World War II, the system of international institutions, treaties, norms, and rules that have governed global relations for almost 80 years. Lavrov is saying that system is collapsing, and he's pointing the finger directly at the United States. Now, I want you to understand the significance of who's saying this. Sergei Lavrov has been Russia's foreign minister since 2004. That's over 20 years in the same position. This guy has seen it all. He's dealt with multiple U.S. administrations, countless international crises, and has been at the center of Russian foreign policy through some of the most turbulent periods in recent history. When someone with that level of experience and longevity makes statements like these, it's not just rhetoric, it's a calculated message. Lavrov also made a particularly cutting observation about American credibility. He said that the United States, by abandoning the principles it had promoted for so long, is damaging its own image. He stated that American colleagues look unreliable when they act this way. Now, this is a critical point because international relations are built on trust and predictability. When a major power is seen as unreliable, that fundamentally undermines its ability to lead, to form coalitions, and to negotiate agreements. If countries can't trust that America will stick to its word or follow the rules it expects others to follow, why would they align with Washington? Let me break down what Lavrov means by the U.S. smashing the world around. Essentially, he's arguing that America is acting unilaterally, ignoring international law, and using force or threats of force to achieve its objectives without proper international authorization or consensus. In Venezuela, whatever Operation Lavrov is referring to regarding Maduro, he sees it as regime change orchestrated by Washington. And historically, the U.S. has been involved in regime change operations in Latin America. So this accusation resonates with a broader pattern that critics of U.S. foreign policy often point to. With Iran, We're looking at a situation where tensions have been building for years. The U.S. withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal under the Trump administration, reimposed sanctions, and has maintained a confrontational stance. Now, with reports of potential military threats, Russia is seeing this as another example of American aggression against a country that happens to be a Russian partner. Iran and Russia have grown closer in recent years, cooperating on Syria, on energy issues, and increasingly on military matters. What's crucial to understand here is that Russia isn't just complaining, they're signaling their intentions. By saying they remain committed to their agreements with Venezuela and Iran, Russia is telling the world, and especially the United States, that they will stand by these countries. This could mean diplomatic support, economic assistance, military cooperation, or other forms of backing. It's a commitment that could lead to direct confrontation between Russian and American interests in multiple theaters simultaneously. Lavrov also mentioned something intriguing at the end of his press conference. When asked about reports that White House envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner might travel to Moscow to meet with Putin, Lavrov said that Putin has repeatedly stated he's open to serious discussions about peace in Ukraine. But here's the kicker. Lavrov said it would be helpful if Washington briefed Moscow on the latest peace proposals for Ukraine. This suggests that despite all the harsh rhetoric about Venezuela and Iran, there's still a channel of communication open regarding Ukraine, and Russia is interested in what the new Trump administration might propose. So we've got this complex situation where Russia is harshly criticizing U.S. actions in some areas while remaining open to dialogue in others. This is classic Russian foreign policy, firm on principles and allies, but pragmatic about negotiations where Russian interests might be served. Now let's talk about what this news really means and what the potential impacts could be, because, folks, this is where things get really serious. We're not just talking about diplomatic spats or angry statements. We're talking about fundamental shifts in how the world operates, and the consequences could affect every single one of us, no matter where we live. First, let's address what Lavrov means when he talks about the international system fragmenting. Since the end of World War II, we've had what's called a rules-based international order. This system includes institutions like the United Nations, international laws, treaties, and norms about how countries should behave toward each other. The United States, as the dominant superpower after 1945, played a huge role in creating this system. The idea was that having rules and institutions would prevent the kind of catastrophic conflicts we saw in the world wars. But here's the problem that Lavrov is highlighting. If the most powerful country in the system starts ignoring the rules when they're inconvenient, why should anyone else follow them? This creates what international relations scholars call a legitimacy crisis. If America can intervene in Venezuela or threaten Iran without going through proper international channels, then what's stopping other countries from doing the same thing wherever their interests lie? China could justify actions in Taiwan, Russia could justify actions in former Soviet states, and suddenly we're back to a world where might makes right, and international law means nothing. The impact of this fragmentation is enormous. Think about global trade, which depends on stable rules and predictable behavior. Think about climate agreements, nuclear non-proliferation treaties, human rights conventions. All of these things work because countries, even when they disagree, generally agree to follow certain rules and use international institutions to resolve disputes. If that system breaks down, we enter a much more chaotic and dangerous world. Now let's talk specifically about Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro's government has been controversial for years. There's been economic collapse, massive emigration, disputed elections, and humanitarian crisis. The United States and many Western countries don't recognize Maduro as the legitimate president. But here's where it gets complicated. Russia, China, and other countries do recognize him. So when the U.S. takes action against Maduro, whether that's sanctions, support for opposition, or whatever Operation Lavrov is referring to, Russia sees it as illegal interference in a sovereign country. And Russia has investments in Venezuela, particularly in the oil sector. They have strategic interests in maintaining influence in Latin America, which has traditionally been seen as America's backyard. If the U.S. succeeds in removing Maduro, Russia loses an ally, and potentially billions of dollars in investments and oil deals. That's not something Moscow will accept without a fight. We could see Russia increasing military support to Venezuela, sending advisors, providing weapons, or even establishing a more permanent military presence. This would essentially recreate Cold War dynamics in Latin America, something we haven't seen since Cuba in the 1960s. The implications for regional stability would be massive. Other Latin American countries would have to choose sides, and the continent could become a battleground for U.S.-Russia competition. Regarding Iran, the stakes are even higher because we're talking about the Middle East, a region already filled with conflicts and home to a huge portion of the world's oil supply. If the U.S. carries out military strikes against Iran, we're looking at potential regional war. Iran has allies and proxy forces across the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and of course close ties with Syria. An attack on Iran could trigger responses across the entire region, and here's where Russia's commitment to Iran becomes critically important. Russia has military forces in Syria, has sold advanced weapon systems to Iran, including the S-300 air defense system, and has deep economic ties with Tehran. If the U.S. attacks Iran and Russia decides to actively support Iranian defense, we could see Russian and American forces in direct or indirect conflict. That's an incredibly dangerous scenario that could escalate in unpredictable ways. Let me talk about the economic impacts. All of this instability affects global markets. Oil prices could spike if there is conflict in the Middle East or if Venezuelan oil production is further disrupted. We've already seen how energy prices affect everything from gas at the pump to grocery prices to inflation generally. A major conflict involving the U.S., Russia, Iran, and potentially other players would send shockwaves through global markets. Your investments, your cost of living, your job security, all of these could be affected by how this situation develops. There's also the nuclear dimension we need to consider. Both the U.S. and Russia are nuclear powers. Iran has been developing nuclear capabilities, which is one reason for U.S. concerns. When nuclear-armed countries get into direct confrontations, even if they start conventionally, there's always the terrifying possibility of escalation. This is why Lavrov's mention of being open to talks on Ukraine is actually significant. It suggests that despite the harsh rhetoric, there's still recognition on the Russian side that dialogue is necessary to prevent things from spiraling out of control. Now, what about China in all of this? China has been watching very carefully. They have their own interests in Venezuela, they have massive economic ties with Iran, and they're in a broader strategic competition with the United States. If China sees the U.S. acting unilaterally and aggressively, they might conclude that they need to be more assertive about Taiwan, the South China Sea, and other areas where their interests conflict with America's. We could be looking at a scenario where multiple major powers are simultaneously challenging U.S. dominance in different parts of the world. The fragmentation Lavrov talks about could also mean the formation of rival blocs. We might see a Russia-China-Iran axis becoming more formalized, with other countries having to choose whether to align with the U.S. and its traditional allies or with this alternative bloc. Countries that try to stay neutral or maintain relationships with both sides could find themselves pressured to pick a side. This would be a return to a bipolar or multipolar world, ending the brief period of U.S. unipolarity that followed the Cold War. For ordinary people like us, what does this mean? It means increased uncertainty, potential economic disruption, and unfortunately, increased risk of conflict. It means we need to pay attention to these developments because they're not just abstract geopolitical chess games. They affect real lives, real economies, and real security. The decisions being made in Washington, Moscow, Tehran, and other capitals right now will shape the world we live in for decades to come. So that's the situation we're facing. Lavrov's statements aren't just diplomatic noise. They're a clear signal that we're entering a new and more dangerous phase of international relations. The question now is whether cooler heads will prevail, whether dialogue channels will be used effectively, and whether the major powers can step back from the brink before we slide into conflicts that nobody really wants, but that could happen through miscalculation and escalation. That's all for today's video. Let me know in the comments what you think about this situation. Are we heading toward a new Cold War? Can diplomacy still work? I'll see you in the next one. Peace.